Hey everyone, Owen here, and today, before we start, I want to offer a bit of a brief channel update. Given the success of The Politics of Twilight Princess, I'm obviously working on some more videos in the same area to come out in the future. However, considering the fact that those take a lot more work than regular, shorter episodes like this, I can't possibly make those on a weekly basis, so I just wanted all of you to know that those are coming. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about a question that's been debated for some time now, whether or not video games are art. Spoiler alert though, we won't actually be debating this question for very long. This is a topic a lot of people who are a lot smarter than I am have already covered, and so I don't really feel like I have enough to add to the conversation to justify an entire episode devoted only to this question. I don't want to be one of those content creators who feels like just by nature of the fact that they're talking about something it's meaningful. I would really prefer to only discuss something if I think I have something actually interesting to say. I'll be talking about it in part 1, sure, but since, again, the question isn't really one that takes an incredible amount of time to answer and subsequently justify, for the rest of the video I'm a little more concerned with certain ideas that the world of games has, both about what it means to be considered art, and our weird ideas about the relationship between artistic integrity and profit motivations. So, as usual, now that that boring stuff is done with, it's time to ask, are games art? For about as long as they've been around, people have been wondering if video games are art. And while it used to be an actually pretty significant debate, to be perfectly honest and fair to the people who are talking about this, in recent years, it has become overwhelmingly popular to make the argument that they are, whether that argument is coming from everyday people or reputable publications or personalities. Even though a lot of gamers seem to have a bit of a narrative of quote-unquote gamer oppression, that is to say a belief that they aren't taken seriously enough by mainstream media or other mediums, it's becoming harder and harder to actually back that belief up with evidence, given the recent mainstreaming of esports, game reviews, and game news in non-game specific outlets, and yeah, think pieces on the artistic integrity and relevancy of games. So many people have discussed this, there are TED Talks about it, which is good enough evidence in my eyes that it's become prolific enough of an opinion that it's not even really worth covering at length because there's little or nothing for me to actually add to the conversation. But since it's important to some stuff we're going to be covering coming up, I think I want to at least explain why, to me at least, artistic integrity is wildly overblown in how narrow the range of things that have it are. Basically, to me, while not exactly the same situation, art is a lot like politics, in that the term basically encompasses everything. And honestly, the ways that these terms are kinda all-encompassing are even, to a degree, connected. What I mean by that is both art and politics are heavily defined by the ways we interact with them. Politics itself is arguably the ways we interact with each other, our society, and power, and art is, while not in the same ways, also very much defined by the ways we engage with it, be that interpretation, criticism, or appreciation. While the stereotypical art critic is someone who's just endlessly making wild interpretations, often really off base from what the author quote-unquote meant, this often being the origin of some humor, some might think to the episode of Seinfeld in which Kramer gets a portrait painted and an old couple of critics argue over whether or not he's a loser, but there's honestly some truth in that. I think it's obvious that I personally think interpretation is a big part of art. I mean, that's what I do on this channel, after all. I know it's a pretty well-liked activity to make jokes about Dennis Prager and Ben Shapiro just getting really mad about visual art and music they don't like. Seriously, if you haven't seen the video where Ben talks about how much he hates Imagine by John Lennon, you need to. It will make you feel way better about any time you felt like you're getting upset about nothing. And I totally agree, it's hilarious, but it's interesting to note that even there, art is eliciting a very strong reaction, which in many cases is kind of the point. And so again, I didn't want to waste your time on this subject, but I think it's important that we covered it because it's important later on, and I wanted all of us to be on the same page. So, on that note, it's time to move on. Okay, so we established that games are art. Cool. I don't really think that many people watching this video were seriously against that concept, especially if they've been on board with my previous videos. But, as I said in that section, and the introduction for that matter, I'm not really on board with the idea that what gamers are actually concerned with is the perception of artistry. Again, as I previously said, it's not really the case that it's seriously debated from places with any serious legitimacy that they aren't art, and no, Joe Rogan doesn't count as a source of serious legitimacy, though that's another video altogether. So, really then, if we're basically getting what we want on that front, what's the problem? Well, the short and easy answer is that, well, they aren't really getting what they want because what they want isn't really a sense of artistic legitimacy. And to explain my thoughts on this, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent, so please bear with me. For some time, but far less so today, gamers in the games industry have fought against anxiety around a perception that the playing of violent video games would lead to and motivate real-world violence. This has been a thing for a while, and to be fair, it predates most mainstream acceptance of games as art. But it brings up a point that I mentioned very briefly in my video on politics and games, being the relationship between gamer feelings of being attacked and criticism. Now, while some people might say that it's a bit unfair to say that resistance to claims of games causing violence is equivalent to rejection of criticism, I think that a lot of people miss just how close the reasoning and justifications for rejection of this claim are to rejections of claims that, say, racism or sexism in games motivate racist or sexist sentiments in the consumer of those games, or other criticisms or analyses of the things depicted therein. This altogether represents a pattern of rejection of the types of analyses that are necessarily part of any artistic medium. Now, since a lot of people seem to be unclear on this, I want to be as clear as possible that you don't have to agree with every criticism leveled at something for you to be accepting of criticism. It's perfectly fine and even necessary to disagree with criticism and make that disagreement known. Adding to the conversation in those ways is important. Dismissing the criticism as inherently invalid, however, by nature of the medium, is a different story, and this, to me, is where the connection between responses to games and violence, criticism, and other types lie. Much of the time, these claims of connections between games and violence are dismissed, not because of studies or actual evidence to the contrary, which I will note do exist, though it's not really relevant that I cite them in this video, or an invocation of the ways that other types of media engage in the same ideas, but because it's just a game, and any such criticism, because of this fact, is inherently ridiculous. The same reasoning used to defend the industry from perceived hysterical criticism from clueless parents in the late 2000s was used to dismiss the ideas presented by Anita Sarkeesian and the other targets of the early stages of Gamergate in the mid-2010s. It doesn't matter if the first kind of criticism is inaccurate, and I'm not going to explain why criticism of content doesn't need data of its effects to be meaningful. You can watch my video on games and politics for that. Acting like it's meaningless because it's just a game is shutting down meaningful criticism as well. We want to be seen as legitimate, we want games to be seen as legitimate or as art, but we actively resist attempts to think of games as legitimate art. Sometimes people seem to think that artistic legitimacy means everyone likes something without thinking about it very critically, at least when it's being discussed around something they personally like, when in fact, arguably the most important part of that legitimacy is the recognition that something is meaningful enough to think about in critical ways beyond is the game good or not. The same people who will act like The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is art and one of the greatest games of all time will get really upset if, say, a queer critic has an interpretation of the game's story through that specific lens. That actually happened. It doesn't matter if you agree with them. If you think games are art, then you should be happy that that person, or Anita Sarkeesian, or Feminist Frequency exists. Even though I really, really hate anti-SJW or anti-feminist critics, I recognize that their existence is something which is unavoidable when dealing with actual art. Now, it doesn't mean that I think they aren't harmful, hateful, and that their bad criticism is bad for art criticism in general. I believe all of those things pretty strongly. But their criticisms are bad because they, well, have bad criticisms, and they should be dismissed, say, because they're racists, or uninformed, or just deceitful, not because the games they criticize are immune to criticism. And that's just an extreme example. It's not like any criticism you don't necessarily agree with entirely should be dismissed. Engaging with them is not only important for the art, but also for forming our own understanding of and opinions about that art. There's a big difference between someone saying, I dislike this game because it has women and forced diversity, and saying, I dislike this game because I think that the sentiments are harmful. One of those things is possible to engage with, and the other is not. I don't think I have to explain which is which. But when we choose to engage or dismiss, it's important that we remember that, whatever our choice is, the thing which we are responding to or dismissing is deeply integral to the art it concerns. Okay, so this next section is a bit of a touchy subject. And to be clear, not because it's at least partially about capitalism. As anyone who's watched my other videos would know, I'm not scared to invoke or tackle that kind of concept if it's necessary, and that certainly hasn't changed here. The reason it's touchy is because I'm going to be treading a fine line. On the one hand, I want to talk about the impact capitalism has on art and how we view that art. On the other hand, though, as we established in the very first section of this video, it doesn't matter the intent, origin, or perceived artistry of something, it's all art. Balancing these two things is a bit difficult, because leftist criticism through an anti-capitalist lens is, in my opinion, very important, and it is even something I engage in. But I think that maybe the way we go about it is imperfect. Now, that's a pretty well-known thing, I have to imagine, that people have their own pretty specific ideas about what counts as high art and what doesn't, something I'll note pretty consistently rooted in classism. People look down on others for, say, enjoying blockbuster movies, media seen as lowbrow, or things with broad appeal, that is to say, popular. But, as I just said, there's this other kind of media critique that comes specifically from the left, and often myself, of certain pieces of media. That they're capitalists. Or, simpler put, made to make money. Now, while there are a couple of problems, in my opinion, with this line of thinking, which I'll get into in a second, I want to make something clear. I do not in any way mean to say that the harm that comes to the developers of games, the various businesses' malpractices harmful to consumers, or the harm that comes to the workers who produce the materials that fuel the games industry, are acceptable or justifiable. These things are awful and must necessarily be addressed to facilitate real change in the games industry. But today, I'm only interested in the art that comes out of this. And with that in mind, the main problem with the idea that capitalist art is somehow less, that profit incentive in some way lessens it. While sure, profit incentive can hurt art by rushing it, making it in some way manipulative to the player or consumer, or in some other way subpar in quality, to pretend that in a capitalist society most art isn't made with this incentive is already naive at best. And again, sure, it's totally arguable that profit incentive impacts artistic vision and quality, but none of that changes to what degree it is art. Capitalism is a weird thing to talk about in relation to art, you know. How do you measure how capitalist something is? How much money it makes? How much it costs to get made? The size of the company who makes it? All of those things, again, are really interesting to consider when thinking about all kinds of aspects of media. But when it comes to simply whether or not something is real art, then I don't really think you have to think into it that much in that way. While the companies behind these games obviously have profit incentives, and while these incentives both influence what games are made, the content of the games that are made, and the ways the games are made, and even considering the fact that, like almost any film, games are made by many people, it simply doesn't matter. As I earlier said, if we are talking about criticism, sure, it's fascinating, and in some cases I'd say necessary to invoke capitalism's involvement. But art is art. Alright, so now we come to the section I basically always have at the end of the video to ask, simply, what's the point of everything I'm saying here? On some of my episodes, the ends end up being a little, well, open-ended, or really interpretive or something, which requires a lot of conclusion to it to kind of explain what my takeaway is. And while there's less of an interpretive side to this one, I think it still leaves us with some interesting things to think about. All in all, while this video is initially asking the question of whether or not games are art, I'd say the main idea here is really two-sided, and a lot like my other episodes. One side being the necessity of creating accurate and good faith criticism as a result of our recognition of the inherent nature of art, and the other being the importance of that in lending artistic legitimacy. To be perfectly honest, I think we're succeeding here. I'm seeing more and more content creators doing the kinds of things I'm trying to do with my channel, and outside of being fun content that I enjoy watching or reading, I think it's really a good sign for the future of games criticism and the industry as a whole. By going beyond asking whether or not games are art, or just deciding they are and not thinking about it too much beyond that, and instead starting to think about it as art to be interpreted, thought about in new ways, and criticized through new lenses, we can progress games forward while looking back, and I'm excited to do that. So, there we have it. I had been thinking about this subject for a while, really ever since my first video, so I'm really glad I actually got to stick around and make the episode. And again, just to discourage any fears that I'm not working on it, more Politics of videos are coming, but they're very time consuming to produce. These shorter weekly episodes aren't coming at the expense of longer ones, they're just something additional I like doing. While I can't really talk about it at length now, I also have a potential deal coming up which might mean more of those longer episodes, so keep your eyes open for that. And before I sign off, I want to sincerely thank all of you for the support. Some of these videos over the past couple of weeks have done better than I could have possibly hoped for, so I can't overstate what all of that means to me. As always, if you have thoughts, rebuttals, or today, I guess, future content comments, make them all in the comments below. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.